What if I told you thousands of men once bled into the same muddy valley, not for a crown, not for a creed, but for a wooden bucket hanging from a rope? A relic so petty it became a banner, a dare, a curse of pride, and if you think that sounds absurd, wait until pigs provoke warships. Birds outflank machine guns and a pickled ear sways a parliament. Subscribe now and stay with me because this is the story of how small grudges grow. Fangs and history learns to kill over nothing. Picture the corridor of a stone tower at night. Damp air, a candle, guttering iron hooks muttering against the wind. And at the end of that corridor a bucket like any other staves swollen with old water, a hoop gone rusty, yet whispered about, as if bewitched not by demons but by the oldest spellmen know the one that turns slight into sacrament and insult into a standard worth dying beneath. Italy, autumn of 1325, city-states glaring over walls, markets bright with oranges, and argument guilds bristling beneath their banners, priests tolling the hour to drown. Tavern boasts, Bologna and Modena pressed close like rival brothers who share a street and 1,000 grudges. In the crowd, a Bolognese apprentice named Matteo carries nails and news, while beyond the gate a Modenese scout called Rinaldo counts guards and shadows. Near dawn, a clutch of Modenese horsemen slips into Bologna like a rumor. No vault is cracked, no treasury forced just a short dash to a public well, where a rope squeals and a wooden bucket rises from black water. Rinaldo laughs a snatch of breath in night air as they sling it over a saddle and vanish. The city wakes to an absence so small it feels like mockery, and in mockery pride sprouts thorns. Bologna's elders crowd a hall thick with incense and outrage pounding the table, not for gold or land, but for the return of that bucket. Because if a neighbor can pluck a symbol from your square and go unpunished, he has stolen more than wood. Messengers are sent with a demand, scribes ink the ultimatum, and murmurs of allies quicken, Guelphs with Bologna, Ghibellines with Modena, old fault lines flaring like dry tinder. Modena's reply is 4 words, and a smirk, come and take it. Bells fly across Emilia, and banners unroll from rafters, dust lifting as armories open. Matteo, who has never ridden farther than the vineyards, is handed a spear and a prayer. Rinaldo, polishing a dented helm, watches his captain hoist the bucket in a tavern as a joke turned to trophy the punchline that marches men to war. Diplomats shuffle between walls as if parchment could mop up pride. Bologna's letter returns unopened. Modena's laughter returns with it, and along the hedges, small raids begin orchards stripped, a farmhouse torched a shepherd, cut down in a ditch. Each bruise demands answer. Each answer compounds the debt, and a thing that began as mischief curdles into duty, then prophecy blood must balance what was taken. The armies choose a valley near Zappolino, where the ground tilts into a bowl of fog and echo. Priests pace and bless breastplates, smiths cold hammer a final rivet, boys fit fingers to bowstrings and learn the weight of killing. Matteo stares at the ridgeline where Modena's standards sprout like iron flowers, while Rinaldo knots the bucket's rope to a cart and jokes that it should ride in the front as their patron saint. Morning splits open with horns and drums. Knights kick free of mud, hooves tearing the fog arrows hiss like 1,000 whispers, and the first collision sounds like a church collapsing. Matteo feels his ribs speak inside his hauberk as a lance glances off, sees a man with his own face fall where his shadow should be, and somewhere in the roar, he remembers the well where women once laughed and water once rose. By noon, the valley has an aftertaste of iron, and the ground refuses to swallow anymore, but the killing keeps teaching itself. Modena breaks Bologna's line, and the chase becomes a harvest. 2,000 lives unstitched from their names over a laughable quarrel. When the bells finally ring, it is from a tower where the bucket now hangs like a crown of splinters, and Matteo, stumbling among helmets without heads, understands that objects do not curse men. Men curse objects and call it honor. Modena poured through its gates with a feral cheer, musicians thumping skins as the captain hoisted the stolen bucket high, boys pelting it with laurel leaves while old men spat for luck. And in the cathedral shadow a priest crossed himself. Not for thanksgiving but for dread, because he knew how quickly trophies harden into altars and jokes into law. Rinaldo, off to the side with a wine jug and a fresh scar, watched the crowd adore wood as if it were destiny, and felt a splinter of unease drive deeper than the wound on his ribs. Bologna's bells tolled like stones dropped down a well and never hitting bottom, as widows pressed veils to their teeth. Scribes inked lists of the dead, and the council swore that no market would open and no festival be sung until the bucket returned, or Modena bled in equal measure. Matteo, arm in a sling and mud dried in the seams of his soul, heard a water seller call into the square and flinched at the word fresh, vowing that if men had made an idol of an empty pail, then he would learn how to break idols. Songs sprouted like weeds mean little ballads traded over wine. Modena bragging of a crown of staves, Bologna answering with verses about thieves who drink from gutters, and each chorus made the rope around the bucket feel thicker, as if praise itself were a knot. Merchants moved in wary caravans. Border shrines accumulated helmets and broken spears, and the countryside learned to keep two kinds of calendars, church feasts and revenge days. Beneath the tuneful spite ran older fault lines. Guelph and Ghibelline city pride and imperial longing names that predated this quarrel and would outlive it, the way a river carries silt from old storms. Condottieri sharpened contracts, taxmen breathed harder at doorsteps, and the trade of iron outpaced the trade of olives, because once a symbol owns a city, the city pays rent in boys. In a cloistered archive where dust hung like patient snowfall, Sister Agnese turned folios with ink-stained fingers and frowned at how careful the chroniclers were with measurements of the bucket's hoop, and how careless with the names of the miller's sons who did not come home. She wrote in the margin that objects become saints when we canonize our pride, and that someday a pilgrim might climb a tower to behold a wooden circle and never ask what it cost. Rinaldo's new post set him on the cathedral stairs, a guard to the trophy that needed no guarding where night smelled of wax and wet stone, and the bucket creaked on its hook as if remembering water. He asked the sacristan if relics could be hollow, if miracles could be jokes, and the old man shrugged, saying men kneel to what they fear losing, which is why we place our emptiness high and ring it with bells. In Bologna, a mason's lodge became a whispering room, where Matteo traced towers in chalk and counted steps under his breath. A baker's nephew had tunneled under walls for a wine cellar, a lamplighter knew which watchman drank, and a seamstress had stitched a rope ladder into a bolt of cloth. Their plan stitched itself from small lives, and for each stitch someone added a prayer, because even blasphemies need blessings to climb. The night chosen was moon-thin and mean with frost pinching the stones, and breath blooming like betrayed secrets. Matteo and 3 others moved like punctuation marks in a dark sentence, pause, dash, dash, leap, until the rope ladder sighed against the cathedral's flank, and hands found holds worn by centuries of faith. Above them, the bucket groaned on its hook as if it sensed a new story reaching for its throat, and then a bell trembled without ringing the worst sound of all. Alarm spread the way oil does fast and staining everything. Rinaldo burst from the stairwell with 2 others, steel flashing blue where torchlight licked it, and on the ladder a foot slipped a prayer, broke a body hit flagstones in a sound Matteo would carry to his grave. The survivors ran because living is a discipline, not a gift. And the morning that followed nailed new proclamations to doors, punished 3 boys with chains, and taught Sister Agnes that the holiest word in any language might be enough, though no one had said it yet. The bucket stayed, of course, because symbols never unlock for courage alone. Modena polished its story until the splinters gleamed. Bologna nursed its bitterness like a last child, and travelers began to ask directions to the tower as if it were a shrine that could absolve them of laughing. Centuries will pass, and the rope will be replaced, and guidebooks will get the street name wrong. But strangers will still crane their necks at a piece of wood and say, "This began a war without seeing the deeper curse, the one that crosses oceans and eras, a pig in a potato patch, an ear in a jar, a flock of birds outrunning machine guns, and a lover sending oranges as towns burn. We will get there. But first remember this valley, because it teaches you how absurdity puts on armor." Winter pressed the valley flat and thin as parchment while edicts thickened like stew. Bologna banned Modenese wine. Modena doubled the levy on Bolognese cloth, and caravans stitched cautious detours across the map. Yet the bucket's creak in the tower seemed louder than all the proclamations. Rinaldo learned to sleep with his sword buckled, dreaming of stairs that never ended, and Matteo learned to read council minutes in the scribe's shadow mouthing the words "Revenge Fund" as if they were a psalm. Balladeers made a cottage industry of humiliation, hawking verses in markets where onions and oaths traded hands, and some nights a bright boy would rhyme so well the crowd forgot to be sad until the refrain returned like a debt. Sister Agnese copied a quatrain into the margin with a sigh, and wrote that someday a poet would turn this into a satire grand enough to make emperors smirk, and when they smirked, they would miss the names of bricklayers and bakers hidden under the meter. Spring brought a trial piece to a monastery, hemmed in by vineyards. A courtyard paved with patient stones, and a table where envoys arranged words in careful stacks as if they were tiles in a mosaic that might depict common sense. Modena wanted apology without surrender. Bologna wanted surrender dressed as apology. And when the monks rang noon, the negotiators agreed only that the soup was good and the olives better, which is to say they agreed on nothing at all. On the road home, a shower drove soldiers under a wayside shrine, and there, between drips and donkey snorts, Rinaldo passed a canteen to a mud-streaked Bolognese he did not recognize until the other man's eyes found his scar. Matteo drank like a man who had forgotten the shape of water, then handed the canteen back and said, "It should have ended in that valley." And Rinaldo said it rarely does, and they left before the rain taught them anything more dangerous than pity. Drought gnawed the hills until wells coughed up air and prayers, and for a bitter month the city that guarded a bucket thirsted at its own fountains. Women bit their lips at dry ropes. Boys learned the sound of an empty crank, and a mason muttered that it was a poor joke the saints would not get while the council, red-faced and practical, sent mules for barrels from a neighbor whose flag they loathed, and whose water they needed the kind of transaction that soils both hands. In August, the rope snapped with a sinner's sigh, and the bucket kissed the flagstones hard enough to bruise the air, the city gasping like a single throat. Carpenters were summoned, blessings doubled, and by the time dusk squared the light, the trophy hung again, this time with an iron collar like a dog that might bolt, and the sacristan said it was a good omen because the wood did not crack, while Sister Agnès wrote that omens are what we call accidents, when we prefer meaning to maintenance. Years made a small economy bloom beneath the tower. Trinket sellers hawked miniatures of the bucket, pewter charms with tiny hoops, and taverns named their sour red after the Secchia. Pilgrims of pride craned necks and squinted at the height, swearing they could hear battle in the wind, while Matteo, who could not bear to pass the square, apprenticed to a stonemason repairing wells in neighborhoods that remembered water as a kindness rather than a wager. And Rinaldo practiced writing his name slow enough to look deliberate, as if a signature might unspool a different life. The narrator's eye climbs above the rooftops and keeps going until centuries thin to threads and maps molt their borders, until banners fade and rails appear, and the bellies of steamships breathe like tame whales, until the bucket is only one exhibit in a museum of human stubbornness. Somewhere, far to the northwest, a string of islands heaves between a newborn country and an old empire, and in a potato patch on San Juan, a man wakes to hoof prints, snorts, and the kind of appetite that does not read treaties. Lyman Cutler was nobody special on paper, just a farmer with a rifle, a fence, and potatoes that preferred not to be stolen until one black boar with the self-esteem of a monarch trotted through the fence, rooted up dinner, and looked so pleased with the crime that the word restraint packed its bags. The shot cracked like a whip across the strait. The pig folded into silence, and for one long breath Lyman believed that problems still ended when you pulled a trigger. Then he remembered neighbors who flew the Union Jack in a company with lawyers older than his country. Charles Griffin, of the Hudson's Bay Company, tallied the pig at $100. With the arithmetic of insult, Lyman offered 10 with the math of a man who had watched his lunch uprooted, and when Griffin promised British arrest, Lyman promised American protection. Officials obliged because flags are allergic to backing down, and in a blink too quick for a lazy island. 3 British warships nosed the channel while 461 American soldiers unpacked discipline and tents. 2 lines of men staring through spyglasses at a corpse that had eaten potatoes, and the wind holding its breath in case a joke became a border. The island became a chessboard of nerves where gulls argued louder than diplomats, tents snapped against the wind, and men in 2 uniforms learned the taste of stalemate. Americans stacked shot by the bluff and practiced artillery drills they prayed not to use. British Marines scrubbed decks that shone like denial, and between the lines a single black carcass lay the way a bad joke lies when no one will admit to laughing first. Nights were the dangerous hours because imagination has better aim than muskets. A lantern swayed, a sentry coughed, and whole ranks tensed as if a cough could tilt empires. Yet more than once a canteen crossed the invisible border and returned full coffee traded for rum tobacco for news, until an admiral weighing honor against headlines decided that 2 proud nations would not set the world on fire over bacon with a name. Orders finally arrived with the sound of paper, soft absolute and blessed holster pride stand down. The guns let a joint occupation dry the fuse. The lines relaxed without admitting it, barrels tilted toward earth, and both camps discovered how quickly fear drains when given permission to be reasonable. While a small grave on the hillside, 4 stones and no sermon became the only casualty anyone dared count. The standoff ended, but the paperwork did not. For 12 long years, the question of sovereignty walked across maps and into tribunals until an arbitrator in a distant capital turned a pen into a verdict, and the island into American soil. Flags changed, the wind did not, and Lyman Cutler returned to his potatoes with a story that made neighbors smirk until they remembered the warships, the cannons, and the way absurdity can look like destiny if you frame it just right. Step back far enough, and borders resemble buckets with latitude and longitude carved into the staves symbols we haul up out of deep wells and insist are water. Men die under those symbols, not because wood or cloth demands it, but because reputation does. And if you think that spell belongs only to medieval Italy or a foggy strait, follow me south and back, in time to warm waters where a single ear learned to speak louder than fleets. In the Caribbean of 1731, a British merchantman swung at anchor under a sun that bleached ropes to bone, and a Spanish guard boat came on with the calm of a rule that does not need to shout. Boards slammed, boots thudded. A captain barked about contraband and courtesy. And somewhere in the scuffle, a cutlass flashed an argument nobody could later unsay, carving an ear from a head and a man from his former life. The grisly trophy pressed into his palm with instructions to show his king if kings cared. Robert Jenkins did not faint or forget. He pickled the thing in spirits and silence a small storm, bottled for a patient season, and carried it through English winters while stories grew around him like frost on glass. Merchants bought him ale to hear the tale. Magistrates listened with one ear and one eye, and Jenkins learned that a relic can feed a man's purpose the way a relic feeds a shrine, drop by drop, until even disgust becomes devotion. 7 years later, the House of Commons filled with wool and chatter, and the heat of breath on cold day then cooled in a hush as Jenkins set his jar on the table, where laws pretend to be immortal. The ear floated like a punctuation mark big enough to end a sentence and begin a war. Members leaning in until outrage caught and spread like a theater fire. Pamphleteers inked their moral arithmetic. Ministers totaled honor's unpaid balance. And somewhere, a clerk recorded that the gallery gasped. War answered with its usual eloquence, sails shouldered out of Thames, fog drums bit into silence, and men who had never heard of Jenkins or Fandinho learned the names of islands and fevers instead. Convoys vanished into weather forts, woke to broadsides, and Caribbean water forgot which language to reflect, as thousands paid interest on a debt first written in brine and blood and displayed in a clear glass that made everyone feel righteous. History keeps its ironies polished. Had Jenkins thrown the ear to gulls, princes might still have quarreled, but fewer mothers would have counted empty chairs. Instead, the jar did its brutal work, and the world discovered again how small objects magnify large vanities. The same lens that once made a bucket a banner, now turning cartilage into casus belli. And if you think this was the strangest campaign of all, wait until a continent sends machine guns against birds and discovers that feather and nerve can outrun pride. Sail east across time, and the map will flip until the blue of the Pacific hardens into a baking sky, and the year on the calendar reads 1932, when Australia asked wheat to be an answer to the Great Depression, and got birds instead. Fields in Western Australia ripened like promises, then shivered as 20,000 emus, 6 feet of muscle nerve and bad manners came down their ancestral roots and found an all-you-can-eat buffet that did not know how to say no. Farmers watched the crop move as if the earth itself had learned a new kind of windheads bobbing above the wheat, like periscopes, stalks vanishing under quick feet and quicker beaks, fences buckling into metaphors about the futility of lines. And when petitions stacked up like bales, the government reached for its favorite hammer soldiers, because surely a continent could intimidate a bird that could not fly. Major G.P.W. Meredith arrived with 2 Lewis guns, 10,000 rounds, and the confidence of a man who mistook the words operation and extermination for synonyms. The first engagement was all thunder and embarrassment as the flock split like mercury bullets sowing empty air, and the lieutenant beside him tasted dust and realized that the birds were not stupid. They were simply better at being emus than men were at being soldiers of agriculture. Trucks bogged barrels, jammed firing arcs turned into punchlines, while the emus did what infantry manuals advise. But pride forgets, disperse, regroup. Harry withdraw. One bird took 3 rounds and sprinted uphill as if pain were a rumor. Another led a platoon in circles until the officer dismissed geometry as a lie. And when the ammunition chest looked lighter, the ledger looked worse. Less than 1,000 kills against a horizon feathered with appetite. Newspapers got wind of it and did what wind does, carried the humiliation everywhere. Cartoons of medals pinned to birds and dispatches describing guerrilla tactics as if the Emu Council had studied Caesar. Meredith wrote his report and accidentally minted a national myth in which machine guns bowed to beaks, the troops were withdrawn, and farmers returned to fences, bounties, and the slow arithmetic of loss, while the world filed this under birds 1, civilization 0, and laughed until someone mentioned a general who sent oranges to his queen. Europe, 1801. Napoleon's continental system tightened like a belt a few notches too far. Spain leaned where France pressed, and Portugal, oldest ally of Britain dependent on English trade, the way a lung depends on air, refused to suffocate politely. Into this walked Manuel de Godoy, favorite of the Spanish court, and lover of Queen Maria Luisa, a man who could make strategy and flirtation the same sentence if you let him. Godoy crossed into Portugal with troops enough to persuade and vanity enough to choreograph towns surrendering like shutters in a wind papers, signed with hands that shook, and amid the smoke he paused to gather gifts, oranges bright and blemishless plucked from groves that listened to weeping, packed into crates that smelled of rind and ash, sent north to Madrid, with notes that said, "What flowers say on quieter days, I am winning you, can you taste it?" The campaign ended almost before the ink dried, Portugal's ports pledged to the blockade that could not last, and the crates kept coming, because a man in love wanted the war to feel like theater, not theft. Later, the alliance would wobble back to Britain, and the continental system would crack where it had seemed seamless, but the name stuck like syrup war of the oranges because fruit is easier to remember than families running, and history adores a garnish even when the plate is grief. Step back, and the pattern is a tapestry that keeps choosing the same flawed thread, a bucket hung like a crown, a pig priced like an insult, an ear afloat in a jar, emus outrunning bullets, oranges sweetening conquest. Objects do not cause wars any more than weather causes ships, but they make lovely figureheads, and men who cannot bear to say pride will say bucket or pig or fruit, and feel morally taller for the substitution. Centuries later, tourists climb a tower in Modena and point their phones at wood, while a guide refrains from counting ghosts. Visitors stroll a quiet cemetery on San Juan and read the pig's single-story headstone in Parliament's archives. A note coolly records that the gallery gasped Australian roads carry warning signs that show a bird mid-stride like a dare, and in Iberian markets, oranges still gleam under lights as if innocence could be polished. We are not done, of course, because the most unsettling lesson is never the relic but the mirror it holds, and the next turn of the story will show you how easily we still polish our reflections into reasons. In a climate-controlled gallery beneath the bell tower, a curator rehearsed the tour in a whisper that respected stone. Glass reflected her face and the bucket's dull hoops, and when a schoolboy asked why anyone would fight for that, she almost said, because pride hates being measured, then caught herself and offered dates, factions, casualties. The clean scaffolding of facts that spares children the messier truth that symbols are weapons for people who fear their names aren't enough. Centuries earlier, Sister Agnese closed her ledger on a winter that bit through cloth and certainty alike, and wrote one last marginal prayer that the Lord teach cities to fetch water without fetching war, that trophies be buried like sins and not displayed like hymns. She underlined it twice, then added a scholar's warning in small script. Objects are alibis, beware the alibi that asks for blood, and sanded the ink smooth with a careful thumb. Ronaldo grew into the kind of veteran who answered stares with knees and storms with silence. Matteo grew into shoulders squared by stone and a gaze that knew the depth of wells, and once in a border tavern they met like mismatched pages pressed into the same book, trading bread without names and stories, without flags, until the owner recognized accents and poured them out the back, where they shook hands like men who understood that forgiveness is a private treaty. No banners can ratify. Time wrapped the blood in literature as time does. A poet named the bucket and made audiences laugh until their ribs forgot the hurt and their politics forgot the dead. Satire softened edges that should have remained sharp, and the city learned to sell its shame as charm. Vendors filled the square with trinkets cast from memory's brighter metals, and the tower rehearsed its one gesture up, 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 while the ground kept its own counsel. In a reading room, far from any battlefield, a graduate student traced the lineage of petty catalysts, bucket to pig, to ear, to emu, to orange, and noticed how each story borrowed the grammar of sanctity relic, witness, procession, pilgrimage. In her thesis, she wrote that modern platforms mint reliquaries out of feeds, and that rage travels faster when embalmed in novelty. And her advisor circled a sentence in red. Outrage prefers a handle, and wrote, "Yes." On a 2-lane road in Western Australia, an old farmer eased his truck beside a battered sign that warned of emus in the most polite font possible, and told his grandkids the tale their textbooks barely believed. He did not laugh at the birds or the soldiers, he only said that some failures are expensive lessons disguised as jokes, and when the children asked if it could happen again, he said, "Of course, though. Next time, it won't be birds, it will be something we think we can't possibly lose to." In a museum in London, a young officer off duty stood before a glass case that held letters from the age of Jenkins and felt the tug of a new kind of jar, the kind measured in views and shares. He knew how one image can become a uniform, how a single clip can load a chamber faster than policy can clear it, and he left with the uneasy knowledge that discipline is learning which relics not to raise. Back in Modena, the guide's last stop was the spiral stair where drafts hum like bees, and tourists become pilgrims without noticing. She had begun adding a sentence to her script, a small rebellion smuggled past the committee. "Do not confuse endurance with righteousness. Stone stands because it is heavy, not because it is good." And now, as phones brightened the dusk, she watched a teenager lower his camera and actually listen. Matteo's last commission was a wellhead in a poor ward, whose water had always tasted faintly of tin. He carved a ring of leaves and left a shallow groove along the lip where calloused hands could rest without slipping, then chiseled a line in letters, plain enough to read by moonlight, "Honor is heavier when lifted together," and when he finished he turned startled to find Ronaldo watching from the shade, and the two men nodded like craftsmen, agreeing that some joints hold simply because someone intended them to. On a night when fog braided with bell rain and the tower breathed like a sleeping animal, a strand of the new rope whispered itself thin, and the bucket gave a sound like a throat clearing before a song. A guard yawned. The curator paused on the stairs. A child in a hotel bed dreamed of ladders, and somewhere a storm shouldered the horizon, making the windows think of old sieges. Listen closely, the past is leaning forward, and what falls next depends on whether anyone remembers what water is for. Morning found the tower smelling of old rope and new worry, as the curator convened a huddle with the sacristan, the guard, and a carpenter, whose hands spoke fluent timber, passing around Sister Agnes's marginal note. "Objects are alibis. Beware the alibi that asks for blood," until the room agreed on a plan that was part maintenance, part mercy. Lower the bucket before the next storm chose for them. Study its seams, name its fractures, and decide whether a relic could retire without shaming a city that had learned to confuse altitude with honor. Word leaked the way stories always do when pride feels watched, and by dusk a knot of townsfolk and tourists had gathered at the square, with the hush of theater audiences, before the curtain some whispering that to lower the bucket was to kneel, and others saying that kneeling to gravity is not surrender but sanity, while an old woman folded her arms and said into no one's ear that sometimes putting a thing down is the first time you truly carry it. Ropes hissed through palms and pulleys talked in polite groans, as the bucket descended each inch a syllable. In a sentence the tower had waited 7 centuries to speak, and when its hoops finally kissed the carpenter's padded hands without a crack, a sound left the crowd, half sigh, half applause, as if relief were a modest miracle. The curator murmuring that objects endure because people maintain them, not because heaven prefers wood, and the guard laughing softly at the blasphemy that felt like truth. In the small workshop below, light pooled like careful thought, while the carpenter traced splits and the curator brushed centuries of dust into a tray that looked absurdly like an offering, discovering beneath the grime a faint carved notch that could have been maker's pride or soldier's tally. She photographed the scar and wrote a label in plain language. This was a bucket, before it was a banner, and slipped beside it the line Matteo had once chiseled on a distant wellhead, "Honor is heavier when lifted together. The exhibit opened with a panel titled Handles of Outrage, a quiet echo of the graduate student's thesis, and visitors drifted past images of a pig's unremarkable grave on San Juan, an engraving of Jenkins' jar surrounded by wigs, and Indignation, a cartoon of emus dodging bullets with the insolence of survival, and a still life of oranges painted so tenderly you almost forget the smoke behind them. Each frame asking the same muttered question: what did we really hold when we gripped these things so hard? A boy lingered at the display where a map stitched Bologna to Modena with red thread and stitched that pair to islands, trade winds, wheat belts, and court corridors, and he asked his mother whether people would ever stop fighting over toys. The mother said that grown-ups rename their toys until the room looks respectable. The boy frowned with the seriousness of rain, and the guide, the one who liked smuggling arguments past committees, added that the easiest way to end a relic's reign is to use it for its first purpose again. And so, because cities learn by staging lessons, a ceremony was announced that confused tradition in order to rescue it, priests and carpenters and schoolchildren crowding the old civic well, where everyone had fetched water before the square learned to fetch tourists, the bucket lashed to a new rope, as if to a new vocabulary lowered into clean depth, while a choir sang, not in Latin, but in the unpretentious key of tap water. And when the bucket rose sweating and real hands cupped and drank, as if the city had rediscovered what its symbol had been hiding. Afterward, the bucket did not return to the hook. It took a place behind glass at shoulder height, where eyes could meet wood instead of necks, learning reverence, the plaque resisting heroics, and offering instead a ledger, dates, deaths, distances, and a closing sentence that was neither moral nor shrug. This artifact helped us remember what we forget, which is that pride is thirsty and water is not a metaphor. And the sacristan, who had seen more prayers than repairs, signed the line like a witness. Rain came that night, not the theatrical kind that stripes paintings, but the municipal kind that fills gutters and solves arguments for roads. The tower humming, as if relieved of a note it had held too long. And in the poor ward where Matteo's well still worked, a cluster of neighbors read the groove his hand had carved for theirs, and laughed at the cleverness of old stone, then filled pails and swapped recipes and baby news, while the city for once did not argue with itself about the proper altitude of meaning. If you stand in that square now, or in the market where oranges shine, or on a road that posts polite emu warnings, or beside a grave that remembers a pig with 4 stones, or in the archive where a clerk once wrote that the gallery gasped, you might feel the old spell tug at your sleeve and ask for another performance. But you can also decline the part and let the prop be a prop, the bucket a bucket, the water water. And if anyone demands a banner, point at the well and say with the softness that outlasts thunder that some thirsts are wiser to quench than to name.